And again, about the recording, that is just the presentation aspect. It is not the discussion, to respect student privacy. There we go. So, like I said, today's discussion is about the history of queer spaces, how queerness relates to the built environment, as well as the act of queering spaces. And so for us, what that discussion is going to engage is through the method of unlearning. And so like we said, the Unlearning series is a series of discussions throughout the summer that aim to question our practices in education in the built environment. And throughout these discussions, what I hope you've been noticing is that the site of talking about the built environment has been through different social structures or a lot of topics of relevance recently in the social climate. And so a recap from last week's Unlearning series was about gentrification. And so we identified gentrification as the process through which low-income communities are displaced through high-income investment, often not being residents anymore of those said communities. And often these communities are marginalized people due to systemic racism, and they are of a lower income status. Gentrification, we said and identified and discussed, can be addressed by making community members active participants in community shaping decisions. We see this through conversations about just green enough, or the just green enough model of green development, as well as ways to make community members active political figures within their settings. And so today I want to start off the discussion in a definition that has come from the work of Aaron Betsky, who's a very large architecture theorist and critic. And he has defined sex and gender in these two ways in his book, Queer Spaces. He defines sex as the biological ordering of the state of the human body, and he defines gender as the cultural and social ordering of the performance of humans. And I want to point out this word ordering, and he uses this word very specifically for reasons we'll talk about further. But focusing on sex having the word biological within its definition, and gender having cultural and social. And so the Western society defines sex based upon genitalia, that is a biological aspect we use it upon, and gender is based upon the performance of humans. And in Aaron Betsky's work often delves into the realm of why do queer folk occupy certain niches of design? Why are I think one of the big questions his work has been going around and started with was why are a lot of the men in interior design programs queer? And that kind of is what started his interest. But he likes to talk about gender as a performance of humans, and that this performance is then ordered based on cultural and social ideas, such as masculinity and femininity. And I think his use of the word ordering here is really interesting, especially for many of us who are of disciplines of the built environment, because we talk about hierarchy as a form of order, about dichotomy, and this word a lot. And we see this in our history of the built environment. On the left, I have the image of the Vitruvian Man, and it's been talked about in queer space theory as the beginning of the idea of order and organization as a masculine idea. That in Da Vinci's sketch of Vitruvian Man, or the ideas, the proportions of Vitruvius, the fact that a masculine body is being used to then create a sense of order, and then that order being perpetuated through the built environment, is the beginning of masculinity as the dominant nature of ordering and of design and of space making. And Corb and the modernists like this idea of order and making these machines for living and whatnot. And so on the right, I have the plan of Chandigarh, which was the capital of the state of Punjab, which was split up through the partition of India and Pakistan. And the modernists and Corbusier, and again, I'm speaking in large brushstrokes, like this idea of order. Here we can see in Chandigarh's plan this rectangular grid and dividing the city neatly with these green thoroughfares. But Chandigarh has also been used as an example of this idea of order being used to tame a state of nature or the found state of peoples into a neat, packageable, consumable thing. If you know anything about this area of India or Chandigarh or the state of Punjab, the local topography is not ideal to follow this set of grid pattern of a city. And so this idea of order is being framed through the conversation of queerness in design as something that is a dominating force, of something that tells agents or components or items how to act in design. And one person I think has done a lot of work while maybe not claiming to be a queer theorist, but really pertinent to this conversation of queerness in the built environment is James Rojas. And so James Rojas is an urban planner who came here actually to Cal Poly last year and talked about his work in Latinx urbanism. But this is a quote from a recent article he did for Common Edge called The Education and Miseducation of Urban Planners. And so a little bit about James Rojas. James Rojas is a Chicanx gay urban planner. He got his master's at MIT, his undergrad in interior design at Woodbury. And this quote is pulled from that article. He talks about many things, but one of them is about his experience being queer and being in the military and understanding urban settings through his time in the military. And so he says, to quote, "Not truly listening to these communities or simply allowing for other ways of being has led to long legacies of conflict, trauma, and oppression. Our urban inequities are not accidents, they're products of design and intention." And so if you look at the full article, and it will be linked, it's linked in our information document as well as in the video after this. He talks about how he felt when exploring the urban cities of America while in service. He felt this weird dichotomy of the military being used as a sense of order in many places. He actually helped serve as one of the peace officers during the Watts riots in LA, and he is from LA. And him commenting on there's this feeling of the need to perpetuate order through systems like military or law, but he felt that certain groups were often excluded or even targeted by these systems of order. And he cited his queerness and his Latinidad as two reasons for his feeling of otherness or oppression from these systems of order. And I think he talks a lot about as well some great points about education of urban planners. So if you're interested in those topics, I recommend you look into his work as well. But I'd like to use his work as a dive-in into actual queer spaces. And so that is a wrong subheading, which will be fixed or captioning. But this is an image of the Stonewall Inn in New York. If you're not familiar with Stonewall, Stonewall was an inn that was a pivotal moment in queer liberation, where Marsha P. Johnson helped, I'm trying to phrase this in the best way possible. Marsha P. Johnson pushed forward the queer liberation movement a lot through a riot that occurred at the Stonewall Inn through an altercation with the police force in New York. And so this is an image from very recently, this year, this Pride Month in June, up of the storefront. And so Stonewall Inn is one of the few sites where queerness has been accepted and taken in. And so if there's this idea being put forth that the urban environment or the way we order our spaces isn't the most accepting to others or those outside of our ideas of sex and gender, I think a very important question to ask is, then where are the people who haven't been included in these definitions, been practicing as designers or just existing in our work? And so while Stonewall is one example of maybe a historicist example, there's also a more contemporary example of the world's first trans cultural district in San Francisco. And so these three women up here are three Black trans women, Honey Mahogany, Saeed, and Janetta Johnson, who helped found the world's first trans cultural district. And so the trans cultural district is based around a bar known as the Steak Knife in San Francisco, which was also another site of queer liberation and altercation between cops over policing the queer neighborhoods of San Francisco. And so that one restaurant was one of the main sites for a larger queer community in the city of San Francisco. And so these three Black trans women worked really hard to get this neighborhood protected under the cultural district protections in California. And what this does, by acknowledging queerness as an innate aspect of humanity and a characteristic of neighborhoods and spaces that must be preserved, is that it allows us to start to see how communities who feel othered by urban planning can start to create their own spaces. And one thing that is kind of a back and forth and push and pull in queer space theory right now is referring it to either as queer spaces or queered spaces. And the difference in the names are subtle, but what they're talking about is, are there spaces that can inherently be queer or begin as spaces for others? Or are spaces just transformed by acts for others? They start as not for everyone, and then they become for everyone. And so you might have seen some differences. Sometimes this talk is called queering spaces. Sometimes it's called queer spaces. It's because of that conflict of asking, are spaces ever truly made for everyone at first? Or is it through some transformative process such as placemaking, as we've discussed, these places become for everyone? And I think one of the things said by Honey Mahogany puts this together really well. In their kind of mission statement put forth to the city of San Francisco in making this a cultural district, it is said, "I believe in creating a space without violence, discrimination, and over-policing. and making sure Black trans women have opportunities for ownership in cultural spaces where they feel safe, she avows. It is most important for us to have a space to visit and visualize what our future could look like. And that phrase of to visit and visualize our futures is really important when talking about queer spaces, and is kind of why there's the argument of queer ring spaces, because these spaces are made for others through their own acts. Someone who is in power cannot imagine the lived experience of a group they're not part of, and therefore cannot create queer spaces if they're not queer themselves. And so some examples I want to give of this process of creating queer spaces, there's a lot of ways you can do it. One, as I've talked about, is the creation of transcultural districts, but it's also just simply through objects within our daily lives. And so this is an image from an exhibition called the Whitechapel Gallery. And so this sculpturist, I guess is the word, sculpture maker, created this exhibition where he took this swimming pool room and he made a variety of objects. And you can start to see on the periphery this like black chair, the empty swimming pool, this ramp, and each object has a meaning. But the one we're focusing on this image is this door here. And so this door is implied to go through a changing room for a public swimming pool. But in a public performance art that was not recorded, this door is given a new meaning by the fact that there are two handles on this door. And so when you look at the door, you assume, oh, the door is a threshold to some new space. It should open the way a door should, either towards you or away from you, and swing and pivot off of one of the sides. But the door isn't functional. And in fact, most of these objects aren't meant to be touched. But what the creator of the gallery is kind of, the point the creator is trying to make, they've said, is that by adding simple alterations to daily objects we interact with all the time, we can start to imagine a different experience. And so the artist created this to kind of talk about, the highly debated topic about bathroom rights, about, trans women, which are real women, being able to have access to a women's bathroom. And so this is one example of, if we slightly alter one object, can it make us start to think about those users who don't usually get access to those spaces or don't feel comfortable in those spaces? Another example that was put out recently by a set of queer activists in North Carolina is called the Dissident Objects series. And so these were a set of DIY flyers they were posting around a lot of urban environments, many cities across America, through support that gave ways of protest using basic homemade objects. So as you can see, a tear gas mask using a soda liter bottle, a face mask, tape, glue, a pen, and an Ulfa knife. Lock-on devices for public protests and like attaching yourselves to sites. And finally, the bike block as a form of like oral or sound protest. And then there's a lot more of these. You can look these up online as well, but I just pulled these three as samples. But this is a process, while it may seem separate from queerness, is an example of how communities can take existing objects and not necessarily designing new ones, and through some method of assembly or putting back together, start to create new uses for these objects. So while these objects are for protest, this can be compared to, for example, the versatility of duct tape for queer folk. For many folk who don't present physically the way society deems certain genders should, for example, for people who are transitioning to become men, they might feel they need to have a flat chest if that's how they want to choose to present their genders. And so duct tape might be used to help bind their chest to be flatter. Drag queens might use this to give the illusion of femininity while performing. And so duct tape, while it is a utilitarian object for many of us for maybe repairs or for home or craft needs, it becomes an object for a performance of sex to, I hesitate to say give the illusion as if they are not real people or real identifiers of the way they want to identify, but to help build the performance of their gender identity. And I, on the daily, while I present as a cis male, have a performance of masculinity that I must do and was taught by society. And so this here is an example of taking existing objects that might have different uses and transforming them into their own. And so based upon those precedents, I want to ask y'all to think, what spaces have y'all been in that have made you feel uncomfortable, you think there could be something different going on because of some way you identify? And what have you done, or what do you think can be done to help make these spaces more welcoming? I give the example of the bathroom. All gender restrooms have been really important in providing safe spaces for everyone in the public spaces they occupy. But to continue the conversation of what else can be done for those who feel like others in public spaces to feel part of the public space and as part of the users of these public spaces.